If you want to grow gorgeous roses but don't know what varieties to start with, this is the video for you. Hello everyone, I'm Amrita Bordake and welcome to my channel. Here are my top 8 recommendations for amazing rose varieties that will get you started in those sun-drenched summer evenings with gorgeous fragrant roses. Before we dive into the actual varieties, these are the 3 criteria that I look for in each of my rose. 1, and this is extremely important for me, they should be fragrant. I do not want to plant a single rose in my garden that is not fragrant. Because according to me, that is the best thing about a rose. That soft old rose smell, oh, nothing beats that. It always reminds me of my grandma's garden. Second, they should flower abundantly. Okay, let's be honest here. If I am putting so much effort into my rose plants, I want them to flower abundantly, especially as I have constraints on my garden space and can only plant a limited amount of rose plants. Third, they should be a strong and disease-resistant variety. There is nothing more heartbreaking than losing your rose plants to diseases, especially after all the hard work you have put into taking care of it. I prefer to do organic gardening, and even when I do use organic pesticide sprays like neem oil or insecticidal soap spray, I don't like to spray the roses a lot. I want plant varieties that are healthy and will require minimal intervention. So knowing the criteria that I look for, here are my top recommendations for rose varieties, especially if you're growing roses for the first time. I'm going to start with my favorite breeder of roses, David Austin roses. I absolutely adore their roses. Here are the top 5 rose varieties that I would recommend to get started with. Number 1 is Lady of Shalott. This is an abundantly blooming rose with rich orange-red blooms that open into chalice-shaped blooms. They have a lovely warm tea fragrance with hints of spiced apple and cloves. The second rose is Olivia Rose Austin. This is a pink-colored rose with cupped rosettes and a delicate fruity fragrance. I love this rose because it is one of the first roses to bloom in my garden in early spring. It almost starts in Feb or March and goes all the way up until December here in Southern California. It is also relatively disease resistant. The third one I would recommend is Boscobel. This rose has coral pink large blooms that are densely packed and have a myrrh fragrance with hints of hawthorn, elderflower, pear, and almond. I love how big these blooms are. And don't you think they remind you a little bit of peonies? The only thing I would say for this plant is, especially when it's young, I would recommend staking it because the blooms can get very heavy for a tiny plant. My fourth recommendation is the Onwick Rose. I think that's how they pronounce it. I'm not sure. A rose with pretty rich pink cup-shaped buds that open into full-petaled shallow cups. These have an old rose scent with a hint of raspberry. I adore how delicate and pretty these blooms look in floral arrangements, especially because of the shallow cup-shaped roses. My fifth recommendation is Princess Anne. These roses start deep pink, almost red, and fade to a pure, rich pink color. They come in large clusters, so one branch usually has about 3 to 4 different blooms. And I have to say this, if you would have asked me last year, I would have said do not buy this rose. It was just not blooming in my garden. Initially, I had it in a pot for about 3 years. It had blooms on and off, and it didn't do that well after the initial spurt of blooms that I had the spring that it was delivered. Then I planted it in the ground last June, and it didn't flower much. I was almost thinking of taking it out this year, but I thought to give it another season and I left it in the ground. And I am so glad I did, because look at this. It has been blooming like this since spring. The flowers are just beautiful and they come in these gorgeous clusters. They're also quite large and lush and last for a really long time on the plant. So these were my 5 recommendations for David Austin roses. The next 3 roses are roses that I tried out for the first time last year, and boy oh boy have they performed in my garden. Oh my goodness, I am in love with these roses and I would highly recommend these to anyone who wants to plant roses. The first one amongst them is the Distant Drum Rose, which has an ombre color that starts off almost bronze brown in the center and then changes to lavender towards the edges. This rose always reminds me of a beautiful winter California sunset. It's got all of those shades in just one rose. They flower so abundantly that 2 weeks ago I had a mixture of 120 mind you, buds and blooms just on one plant. I planted this rose only last June, so it's barely been a year, and it has performed so well. It bloomed non-stop from last June until last November and then started this March and it's still blooming. The second rose I would recommend is called the Coco Loco rose. This is a Floribunda rose that starts off milky chocolate and changes into a gorgeous soft lavender as it blooms. It is moderately fragrant and is also one of the early spring bloomers. I am such a fan of this color and I'm so glad I planted this in front of my kitchen window. I absolutely adore waking up to these stunning flowers every morning. The third rose has become one of my favorite white roses. And I almost didn't buy it when I was planning my garden because I hadn't heard about it. It is the Easy Spirit Floribunda rose. This rose has a gorgeous cream color and a delicate fragrance. Look at the size of this rose. I love this rose because of the abundance of blooms that start from March and go right up until December here in California. It blooms so much that my neighbors have stopped over and asked me if they could take cuttings of the rose and what is the variety that I'm growing. It just looks amazing. And I've also planted it in a tree rose form, so they look quite unique. They look like these beautiful tree roses that are always laden with these beautiful blooms. I hope you enjoyed this video and it will give you inspiration to plant a rose in your garden. There is nothing else that can beat having a cup of tea by a gorgeous blooming rose on a warm summer afternoon. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite rose and who will you give a home in your garden. Thank you so much everyone for joining me today and have an amazing day. Bye-bye.